and a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. On September 25th, 1789, our founders, having just completed the Constitution, finished drafting the Bill of Rights, a list of guaranteed rights that the U.S. government was not to infringe upon. Why did they consider such a thing to be so important? Well, our founders had just experienced tyranny. They had just fought a revolution against the government that had failed to respect man's fundamental rights, that had overstepped its bounds, and that had gone tyrannical on the people that it served. Our founders knew it all too likely that such a thing could easily happen again. And so they wanted to guarantee that man's rights were respected, hence the Bill of Rights. But at the end of the day, the Bill of Rights and the greater Constitution is just a piece of paper. What is to ensure that the government follows it, that it doesn't go corrupt or go tyrannical on its people, just like the British Crown had? What happens when checks and balances fail, politicians rig elections, if the government just stops respecting the Constitution? Enter the Second Amendment. Our founders were extremely black and white with it. The right to bear arms shall not be infringed. Our founders were fully aware that the government that they had just created could all too easily go tyrannical on the American people. After all, that exact thing had just happened. So our founders asked themselves, what stops a government from going tyrannical on its people? What keeps democracy and the freedoms and liberties that we enjoy as Americans? What keeps it alive? What stops the government from just deciding to no longer respect freedom of speech, uphold the Constitution, or even hold democratic elections? An armed population prepared to resist it. When all other checks and balances fail, the Second Amendment was to be the last and most effective check and balance. As Thomas Jefferson put it, when governments fear the people, there is liberty. When the people fear the government, there is tyranny. The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny and the government. According to the words of the second and of our founders, any attempt by the government to restrict civilian ownership is a violation of the rights of the people. Yet, today, millions of Americans no longer see it the same way.
A place where a tipping point launched a movement.
Following the 2018 massacre in Parkland, Florida, young people across the country started the gigantic movement known as March for Our Lives. A movement that does not take "shall not be infringed" quite so literally. Led by activists like David Hogg and Emma Gonzalez, the movement sought to end mass shootings by advocating for a number of forms of gun reform, including a universal background check, tighter restrictions on firearm transfers, and, most notably, called for a ban on, quote, assault rifles.
It stops here with this administration and me.
This desire to ban so-called assault rifles is also shared by many leaders in Congress.
Do you believe an 18-year-old high school student should be able to walk into a store and minutes later come out with an AR-15 style assault weapon and hundreds of rounds of ammunition?
Some in America even push for a total repeal of the Second Amendment and a blanket ban on all firearms in the name of safety and putting an end to the nation's gun violence epidemic.
I believe in the ban of all guns.
This opinion is far from fringe, considering it is one openly held by California Senator Dianne Feinstein.
For an outright ban, picking up every one of them, Mr. and Mrs. America, turn them all in, I would have done it.
Even some gun rights organizations like the National Rifle Association support what some constitutionalists would consider to be an infringement. In 1986, the NRA endorsed Ronald Reagan's National Firearms Act, which included a blanket ban on all automatic weapons. If one is to interpret the words of the Constitution and our founders directly, then the restriction on the right of civilians to possess any class of firearms is a direct infringement on the Second Amendment. As the textualist organization known as Gun Owners of America puts it, arms protected by the Second Amendment include fully automatic weapons. Now, when one thinks of the American experience, free speech, democracy, and economic opportunity might all come to mind. The right to bear arms likely does not. It's a constitutional right that, to many Americans, is taken for granted, and to some Americans, totally disregarded by. Yet, the great society that we live in, one of freedom and personal liberty, one free of government overreach, is kept alive by the right to bear arms. Opponents of the Second Amendment consider the idea that our government could turn tyrannical and threaten the freedoms and liberties that we hold dear as Americans to be ridiculous. And yet, according to a study done at the University of Hawaii, governments in the 20th century are responsible for the deaths of 262 million people. Why is this number so high? Could it be because of the inability of the populace to defend themselves against this tyranny? Look at just the 4 most famous genocides of the 20th century, and you will discover a lack of ability of the people to bear arms in every single one. The right to bear arms is arguably the most important right in the entire Constitution. It protects all the other ones, including the freedom to stand for or against gun rights. It protects the freedom of Americans to speak out for what they believe, pursue the opportunities that they wish, and protect the basic and inalienable liberties of man, the very freedoms that we sometimes take for granted as Americans. It is this check on government power that ensures that we are a free, happy, and democratic people. Without it, we would be at the complete and utter mercy of government, a lesson learned by hundreds of millions throughout the 20th century. The ultimate question now, in the 21st century, is will Americans uphold the principles of our founding, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or will we submit ourselves to the mercy of government? I'm Vince D'Adolosio.